Okay, give me a second here and we're going to get started. So I've just been watching the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin. I'm guessing a lot of you have just watched it as well. But if you haven't, I'm going to save you a lot of time here because it is over 2 hours long. So what I thought I'd do is just do a quick summary. I took a load of notes for you just because I know how busy a lot of my subscribers are. So I've done all the notes for you so that if you haven't got time to watch the 2-hour video now, then at least you'll know the summary and then you can watch the full interview later on. So let's get into it. The first, it was a very, very interesting interview. That's what I'll say first of all. I was quite surprised at how the interview went. I thought it would go slightly differently, but it was very interesting. I think the Western media are going to have an absolute meltdown at the interview because if you think about other people that have interviewed Putin, it's been very sort of controlled. The whole interview has been controlled from the Western media point of view. And they were, if you look at it in the past, they were very easily able to try, you can't control Putin, obviously, but that's what they've always tried to do. And it was always fine for them to interview it. But now that Tucker's done it, the Western media are in meltdown. So he has some very interesting questions. I've got pretty much all of it down here. There was only a couple of points I didn't make a note of because I didn't think they were relevant. I thought there was a couple of boring points. But so if you're going to watch the interview, the first thing I'd say is the first 25 minutes is pretty much a massive history lesson by Putin, which was, excuse me, which was surprising. The first 25 minutes was a history lesson, so that was quite funny. And then he explains, so Putin explains his reasons for entering Ukraine. So obviously Tucker Carlson asks him why. Putin says he doesn't consider it an invasion because he doesn't exactly see Ukraine as separate to Russia. He sees them as the same people, and he goes into this big history lesson and he explains why he thinks they're the same people. Again, I'm just going over what was summarized in the interview here. I haven't had time to really stop and think about every last point to give my thoughts and opinion on it. This is purely me sharing the summary of what was said. Okay, so just gotta say that because otherwise people will blast the comments and call me a Putin lover and all sorts. So here we go. Putin then goes on to explain that he felt he had no choice but to enter Ukraine because NATO broke its agreement not to expand towards Russia, and yet it did. So he said that he constantly, and his diplomats constantly, asked NATO not to keep advancing, and they continue to do so. He said they put NATO bases really close to Russia, and he was worried that nuclear weapons were about to be put in Ukraine. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he said that would have been the end of Russia. Later on in the interview, he said that NATO expanded not once, but 5 times, and they protested this, and nothing happened. So again, this is what Putin said as to why he went into Ukraine. He then said that he and his predecessor tried for decades to build a relationship with the United States, but the United States didn't want a relationship. Tucker asked why, and he said, I don't know why this happened. He then said that he had asked Bill Clinton at the time if Russia could join NATO, and Clinton said no. Tucker asked him if he would have joined NATO if he were permitted, and Putin said yes, they would have gone through the process, but whether it would have been accepted, he doesn't know. I was quite surprised by that. I had no idea that was the case. He then talked about the US funding terrorists in the Middle East for a long period of time. So he's talking about how the US is the police force of the world and they put their agenda on the world. So Putin had a lot to say on this. He then said that US presidents don't actually run the country. I was a bit surprised by that he would say that. He asserted this by having made an agreement with the president only for them to say later that they had to negate on the agreement. Excuse me. He also said that Ukraine democratically elected a new leader, but the opposition didn't accept the decision and they had backing from the US, so he was overthrown. So he was saying this Ukrainian leader was overthrown, and he said it was all backed by the US. He then claimed the US helped a coup in Ukraine. So again, there's some massive claims here on this interview. He also said that the EU opened its borders to Ukraine for trade, but Russia also had its borders open for trade with Ukraine. So he said Ukraine couldn't have it both ways, and it could have led to Russia being flooded with EU products. Putin then says the CIA conducted another coup in Ukraine over trade. He then said that Russia had to take Crimea under their protection due to it being bombed, due to not accepting the coup. So he was saying the residents didn't accept the coup. And then he later talked about Donbass. Again, I wasn't aware of this massive bombing military campaign that he talked about. Putin claims that he asked NATO for decades not to keep putting military bases near Russia. So he went on to say this again. He then claims that Ukraine started this war and that he didn't start the war. He said that Ukraine started the war back in 2014 and that 2022 was just a special military operation. It was Russia's response to try to stop the war. So again, he claims that Ukraine started the war and not Russia. He claims he's trying to denazify Ukraine. Tucker asked him, what do you mean by that? And Putin said Ukraine was recreated based on some heroes of the past, but in a bad way under Nazism, and that he's trying to cleanse it of this. Again, I don't have all the details on this point, so I can't comment on some of this. I'll have to really review this, study it, and then I can respond. He said that if Ukraine wants to be a separate state, then it's absolutely fine with him. But it can't be based on Nazism, and it cannot be next to Russia because it poses a security risk to Russia. And he said that they cannot persecute persecute Russians in that region. Putin then said Zelensky is a Jew, and this was in relation to a comment about the Canadian Parliament applauding an SS officer who killed Jews in World War II. So basically, there's a long story behind this. There was this SS German officer who was invited to the Canadian Parliament. He got a standing ovation, and Putin says, how on earth was this possible that he was invited and got this standing ovation? And why was Zelensky happy to be friends with this guy when Zelensky's father fought against this guy, right? So it was a big complex story, but bottom line, he emphasized Zelensky is Jewish. Tucker asked Putin why the peace talks haven't progressed, and Putin said they did, but after Russia withdrew from Kyiv, withdrew the troops from Kyiv, the West, and he specifically said the US and the European Union, intervened and made Ukraine trick Russia and attacked them. So he's basically saying that Russian troops were in Kyiv, they had an agreement with Ukraine, so they withdrew from Kyiv, and as they did, he said the US and the EU had this plot to trick Russia, and they attacked them and hit them quite harshly. Putin says that he and Joe Biden hadn't spoken since the war in Ukraine began. Tucker emphasized that Biden was funding the war and surely they would talk, and Putin said, no, what is there to talk about? Tucker asks if he thinks NATO wants to push this war forward. Putin responded, yes, and NATO is trying to put fear into the populations by inventing a Russian threat that doesn't exist. So Tucker then responded and flat out asked Putin if he intends to expand and attack other European countries. And this is where Putin starts laughing, and he responds, there's only one case that we would ever do that. And he said, and that's if these EU countries, say for example, Poland and Lithuania, attacked Russia first, then yes, he would respond. But he said, absolutely not. We don't want to expand further. This is absurd. It would bring a global war. So that's interesting because if you listen to the Western media, their whole premise is predicated on this story that Russia wants to conquer all of Europe. And I've said from the start, I think that's very, very far-fetched. And, whether or not Putin's responded to that. He said, no, we don't want to do that. And, he's emphasized what they're doing in Ukraine. Again, I'm not getting into it all. I'm just explaining what's being said. Putin says the CIA blew up Nord Stream. Tucker asked why he didn't tell the world and present the evidence. Putin says because there's no point. The USA owns the entire world's media everywhere, so it would be pointless because the propaganda, he's basically saying the US would just put out their propaganda machine and they would, make it out to be a lie. So he said it's pointless even to put it out there. He also talked a lot on the different pipelines, and he says it's pretty obvious what's going on. There's a pipeline for Germany right now with all of their energy, and they haven't turned it on. Why don't they want it turned on? He's trying to say that their economy is absolutely collapsing, and they're still not turned on this pipeline. He says it's obvious what's going on. Putin then said the US made a grave mistake by weaponizing the dollar. Now other countries are downsizing their dollar reserves out of fear of what happened to Russia. The dollar gives the US its power. 80% of Russian trade was in US dollars up to 2022. Now it's very, very minimum. And he said it's a big mistake because all the BRICS nations are trading with one another. Putin then said that BRICS has now overtaken the G7 in trade and are growing rapidly while the G7 are declining. He says the United States and the EU knows this, so they are using force to try to slow this decline. He said it's all led by the US. Putin says despite the illegal sanctions against Russia, they were still the #1 European economy in 2023. He claims the sanctions didn't work because the Russians just found a way to get around them. This is one of the most shocking claims as well from the whole interview. Are you ready? He claims that there was a peace agreement made and it was almost ratified with Ukraine 18 months ago. However, I don't know if he said that. So Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, I don't know if he said he flew in or what happened, but Boris Johnson, Putin claims, came in at the last minute and stopped the peace agreement. He said he was acting under the Biden administration, and he said that Ukraine should fight Russia and that the West, would give Ukraine whatever they needed for the fight, so not to stop the fight. So that is a pretty bold claim. I think we're probably going to see a lot of that in the media, or maybe none of it at all. But I thought that was a very, very bold claim that he's saying that Boris Johnson did that, stopped this peace deal. If that's true, wow, that is pretty crazy. Putin claims the West and Ukraine have now realizing that defeating Russia is impossible, but they don't want to back down and they don't know how to get out of the mess. He said it would be funny if not so sad, and then they laughed about it. Putin summarized by saying that this is in effect a civil war and that the West shouldn't get involved, and that these two peoples will be reunited in time. So that is the main sort of overview of the entire interview then. Hopefully this was a good time saver for you. I thought I'd watch it as soon as it came out, so it's only been out for a couple of hours as I'm streaming right now. So I watched the entire thing, took loads of notes, and yeah, that's it. So you're up to date on it all. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments and how you view the interview when you have time to watch it. It is a couple of hours long, and yeah, I'd just like to hear your views on it actually. So that's it, you're up to date. I'm gonna get ready now, go out and do the walk and talk, and post that UK this evening time. All right, see you later. Take care. God bless.